Welcome to Shattering Myths, a program devoted to those who know that the world's political, religious, media, military, and economic institutions are rotten to the core, that they are the problem, and that there can be no religious, political, military solution to what ails our planet. Our mission, therefore, is to look behind the headlines, to know who is perpetrating the crimes that over the next 15 years will wreak havoc on our world, because not only is it appropriate to expose them, condemn them, and hold them accountable, when more people come to understand that the institutions they have shown loyalty to and have praised are working against them, then there is a greater likelihood that more and more individuals will reach out to God, will come to explore His Torah, because His covenant provides the only reliable answer. Our phone number, if you'd like to participate in this discussion at any time over the next 2 hours in what will soon be a 3-hour program, is 877-300-7645. I was going to begin today's program with a review of previous discussions, but an article caught my eye as the news was playing, and it is extraordinarily somber. You can probably tell it in the tenor of my voice. Children now have been found beheaded in the Central African Republic's capital. 16 children have been killed in this way. We have spent several programs talking about the nature of the atrocities in the Central African Republic. And American newspapers and for the most part in British papers, it is called tit-for-tat clashes. They use the exact same terminology, showing either a complete incapacity for rational thought or for journalism, or that they're reading from the same hymnal. This article from the BBC reads about 100,000 people have been killed in tit-for-tat clashes in Bangui, and about 370,000, about half the city's population, has been displaced. The tit-for-tat, from their perspective, is Christian and Muslim militias are fighting each other. They always even put the Christian militias before the Muslim militias. This story is actually related to the bigger story that we're going to be talking about today. But it is such a vivid picture of what's wrong with our world, I wanted to begin here. Muslims represent 15% of the population in the Central African Republic. They acted out in accordance with the Hadith and Quran in a manner consistent with the example of Muhammad and became terrorists. They engaged in kidnapping. They engaged in the slave trade. They engaged in rapes, looting, pedophilia, and gruesome mass murders. All of those things are behaviors that Muhammad himself exemplified and praised. And Islam is based solely on Muhammad's words and deeds. Now, I don't say this to be hateful. I say this because it's true. Anyone who takes 50 hours of their life, 50 hours, a few hours an evening for a couple of weeks, just 50 hours of your time, and you read Prophet of Doom. You can find it at prophetofdoom.net. You will find the most comprehensive, the most contextual, the best documented, and the most chronological presentation of the 5 oldest Islamic sources. You'll find the Quran set into the context of Muhammad's life and rearranged chronologically so that it can be easily understood. And you will find that according to the oldest Islamic sources, Muhammad was one of the most perverted people who ever lived. He was a pedophile. He was a rapist. He was a child molester. He was a mass murderer. He was a slave trader, kidnapper. Above all else, he was a terrorist. And so the kind of behavior that we're witnessing in the Central African republics is exactly the kind of behavior that was manifest by Muhammad, and the Quran tells Muslims that they must follow his example. Sharia law is based entirely on Muhammad's words and deeds. And so that's why they cut off the heads of little children, thinking that they're doing a service to their God. Now, in the Central African Republic, the problem is, of course, deeper, because the 15% that are Muslims negotiated a peace treaty with the political leader of the Central African Republic. He evidently had never read his history and was unaware of what happens to those who negotiate peace treaties with merciless groups, although history is rife with examples. And he led his country into this situation because, as is the case with the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, that forms the basis of the 9th Surah of the Quran, a treaty between a Muslim and a non-Muslim is not binding on the Muslim. They use treaties to make their prey more easily killed, more easily controlled. And so this is what brought these hellish conditions on the Central African Republic. A 15% minority inspired by Islam. They're not radicals, they're not extremists. They're not members of al-Qaeda, they're simply fundamentalist Muslims motivated by Muhammad's words and deeds. And they've become merciless, raping hundreds of thousands of women, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians, robbing them, burning their homes to the ground, and now cutting off the heads of little children. And yet the media reports this is a tit-for-tat affair of Christians fighting Muslims, as if they're above it because they're socialist, secular humanists, and it's Christians that are inspiring the Muslims to act badly. It's the Christians' fault. It's religion's fault. It is religion's fault. It's Islam's fault. You know, in most places where Christians are a decided minority in Muslim lands, they do not defend themselves, such as the case with the Copt Christians, such as the case with the Roman Catholics in Syria, such as the case with the Assyrian Christian population in Iraq. They did not defend themselves. They were mercilessly slaughtered. Such was the case with the Armenian Christians in Turkey following World War I. Such was the case with the Christians in the Balkans, as they were ravaged by the Muslims who had accepted Nazism and had become members of Hitler's SS. And Serbian Christians was the word I was looking for. 800,000 of them murdered by Muslims and by Roman Catholics, tortured in the process. In countries where the majority is non-Muslim, Christians have a tendency after a while to defend themselves. And in this case, the Christian militia is called anti-machete. They're opposed to the machetes that are being wielded by the Muslim gangs that have stolen their homes, who have invaded their communities, who have raped their women, who have killed their children. This is not tit for tat. But the media's reporting of it causes those who are not willing to look behind the headlines to be misled and not recognize the horrific nature of this religion and why the religion of Islam is so incompatible with civility, with mercy, that so long as it is embraced and tolerated, as it is coddled in the media and by politicians, the world will be awash in horrid acts of terrorism, of which fundamentalist Muslims perpetrate 99.9%. That leads us to the story that I promised that I was going to cover today from the New York Times, where a staff of New York Times editors decided that since their girl is Hillary, and that the thing that is most damning to her is the events surrounding Benghazi and the aftermath and the reporting and the statements by Hillary and the administration following Benghazi, since that is her Achilles heel now, that they would write a puff piece designed to make it seem like she was telling the truth when she was lying. Now, since the article has appeared, and we're going to spend some time with the article in future programs, we won't get to it today, although I will share with you its lead-in statement, since that was all that the New York Times wanted anybody to read, and then just say, oh, well, there's lots more here, so they must have support for these claims. They don't, of course. But I want you to know just how serious the problem is and how disingenuous, duplicitous, hypocritical, overtly dishonest the media is, including what is probably the best-known newspaper in America, the New York Times. We're going to cover this story because as the events of Benghazi played out, I was in the midst of doing this program. And what I said at the time was that this may be the biggest story of our time. And it's the biggest story of our time not because of the deaths of 4 people, although that's tragic, but because of how the event was portrayed by the President of the United States and how the media and his foes then responded to it. And we'll return to that story after the commercial break. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. The reason I considered the events surrounding Benghazi and the aftermath to be earth-shattering relative to our times is because of what they reveal about us and about where we're going. You see, the United States, at the behest of Barack Hussein Obama, who lit the flame for what's dubbed the Arab Spring, which was an Islamic Reformation in actuality, and Arizona Senator John McClown, they decided that the way to achieve a better world was to supply weapons to the jihadists in Libya. Mind you, they were the same jihadists, exactly the same jihadists, that America fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, trying to kill them there, but now providing weapons to them in Libya. And the reason I say exactly is that the Libyans provided the most international jihadists in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and now in Syria. That's not my opinion. Research it. The largest number of international jihadists participating in those conflicts came from Libya, particularly Benghazi. And And so the United States decided that through Qatar, we would provide them not with just AK-47s. Oh, that's for the Boy Scouts. Nah. We gave them surface-to-air missiles. We gave them 50 caliber machine guns. We gave them anti-aircraft weapons. We gave them anti-tank weapons. And then, since that wasn't enough, we ran bombing missions and dropped bombs on Libya on behalf of the Islamic jihadists. And we justified it by saying, oh, Muammar Gaddafi, bad guy. Yeah, Muammar Gaddafi was a syphilitic. There was a time in Muammar Gaddafi's life where he was worse than the average Islamic dictator. But he was basically a self-serving secularist. And as is the case in the Islamic world, when religious fundamentalists replace a secular dictator, things go from very bad to infinitely worse. That's what happened in Iraq. It's what's going to happen in Afghanistan. It is what is exactly the fate of Libya. Since the time that America, through Qatar, began to aid and abet and arm the Islamic jihadist, not only has Libya become a living hellhole, a country now governed, and I put that in quotes, by terrorists, but it is the primary supplier of weapons for fellow Islamic jihadists throughout northern Africa. We created a disaster. And that disaster came back to bite America because the very weapons that we had supplied, in fact, one of the terrorist organizations that was created during the Libyan Civil War, that America armed, that America financed, that America used, was the Islamic terrorist organization that killed the ambassador and 3 others in Benghazi. The name of that terrorist organization is Ansar Sharia. The CIA, military intelligence, the State Department, in Benghazi all knew that the attack was being planned and was perpetrated by Ansar Sharia. Ansar Sharia is an extraordinarily telling name. It means friends or supporters, Ansar, of Sharia, which is Islamic law. Islamic law isn't the concoction of a group of politicians or judges. It's not an austere or radical interpretation of Islam. Sharia law is based entirely, exclusively, on the Quran and Hadith, and about 95 to 99% of it is based upon the Hadith, which is oral reports from Muhammad and his companions. You can't have anything that is more consistent with Islam than Sharia. You can't have anything that is more in keeping with Muhammad's words and deeds than Sharia. It is based entirely on his words and deeds. And so someone trying to impose Sharia is not an extremist, they're a fundamentalist. They're not a member of or an affiliate of al-Qaeda. They're nothing but a good Muslim. We'll return to this discussion after the commercial break. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. So, the United States bombs Libya and arms jihadists, and the fundamentalist Muslims, following Muhammad's example, create a terrorist state in Libya. And the same terrorists, in fact, a group that was actually conceived during the middle of the American malfeasance, Ansar Sharia, which name explains exactly who they are and what they're doing and why they're doing it, uses those very same weapons to murder 4 Americans. And rather than acknowledge the utter stupidity, the moral bankruptcy that was involved by Barack Hussein Obama and John McClown out of Arizona, and deciding that we should arm the Libyan mujahideen and that we should bomb Libya, making a bad situation much, much worse. No. What did this administration do? And the head of its State Department, they edited the CIA briefing paper out of Benghazi 12 times. Made 12 edits to it. Sent it back to them and said, no, I don't want to say that. Maybe true, but I don't want to say that. It's not what I want to report. Give me a different document. And this president said that the murder was inspired by a horrible depiction in film of Muhammad. And therefore, a fundamentalist Christian, a Copt Christian from Egypt, was blamed, even though it was not true. And even though the truth was extraordinarily important for people to hear. This is why you don't do what we did in Iraq. It's why you don't do what we did and are doing in Afghanistan. It's why you don't do as we almost did in Syria. It's why you do not do what we did in Libya. It was a lesson. And rather than learn that lesson, understand the consequence of arming jihadists, this president chose to lie because he wants to have a war against extremism. Can't be against Islam. He wants it to be against extremism. You can't say the truth that it was perpetrated by Ansar Sharia when somebody in 3 seconds can Google Ansar Sharia and find out that it means supporters of Sharia law, and that then they Google Sharia law and they find out that it's based entirely on the words and deeds of Muhammad. And the gig's over. A bold-faced lie. Everything that you have done and said in your war against terrorism is torn asunder. Your war is not against terrorism, it's against Islam. You're destroyed. The enemy is Islam. Your credibility is absolutely torn asunder. So what did he do? The president lied. He blamed a Copt Christian and his film. Now, by the way, the film, Innocence of Muslims, never been completed. It's just a trailer that has been done. And the purpose of the film wasn't to discredit Muhammad. It was to expose the hideous treatments of Copt Christians in Egypt by Muslims. And the only reason that it reveals some of what we know about Muhammad is because if the Muslims who are perpetrating the terror against the Copt Christians know that Muhammad isn't someone worthy of them following, then at least in a rational person's mind, they wouldn't kill for him. And so Muhammad was accurately depicted, although the movie was childish in terms of its production quality. But Muhammad was a pedophile. Muhammad was a rapist. Not by some enemy of Islam saying, oh, I want to smear this guy because I'm afraid of him. I'm a Islamophobe, so I'm going to slander him. No, the 5 oldest Islamic sources all present Muhammad as a ruthless terrorist, as a pedophile, as a rapist, as a slave trader, as a kidnapper, as a mass murderer, as an avowed liar, as a thief. And it's not some tiny percentage of the references to Muhammad that depict him so negatively with then a magnitude greater number of references that depict him glowingly. That's not the case at all. In fact, it's the opposite. 99% of the references to Muhammad depict him in this negative way. And a scant 1% depict him positively. That's the nature of this beast. And so that's the reason that the movie trailer showed Muhammad as a rapist, as a pedophile, as a womanizer, as a slave trader. He was. Now, if the truth defames someone, then so be it. You know, if the truth accurately presented is inflammatory, maybe you ought not be aligned with such an individual or his religion. That's the nature of this movie. And so the President of the United States, even 5 days after the attack, knowing for certain that what he had said previously was a lie, repeated it in front of the United Nations. So this now becomes an incredibly embarrassing issue for Hillary Clinton, because the president blamed the State Department for its failings. Hillary Clinton fell on her sword. That's why she resigned. She got no support for Barack Obama, who had actually created this series of lies, this web of lies. And now, as Hillary is preparing her run for president, the New York Times is her principal advocate. And so the New York Times wants to recast the story, damn the evidence, to exonerate Hillary so the decks are cleared for her to run for president. The problem is that there's still a few people out there, not many, but there's a few, who don't much like being lied to. That laughter in the background was from Larry. And Larry, we're going to consider 3 stories about the response to the New York Times editorial on Benghazi, and I'm going to read the opening paragraphs on that story. And then we're going to, in future days, actually go through the reporting of the New York Times, because their willingness to present deceit, pure and unmitigated deceit, on behalf of an upcoming political candidate, particularly on what is among the most important issues of our day, which is, what is Islam, and why are 99% of terrorists Muslims, and why are we engaged in a war against an irrelevant aspect of the religion, Al-Qaeda? So here, Larry, this is the opening lines from the New York Times article. It says, 15 months after the September 11 attack in Benghazi, which killed Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 other Americans, the narrative of the attack continues to be shaped and reshaped by politicians and the press. Boy, is that ever true. As a matter of fact, before I read the next statement here, in fact, that's actually a statement from one of the, I think that's actually from Fox News. I'll get to the statement as it reads in the New York Times, because that's actually a true statement. The attack continues to be shaped and reshaped by politicians and the press. One of the great problems of this, and the reason that you and I are no longer conservatives politically, would not be affiliated with the Republican Party, of which both of us were once affiliated. You were extraordinarily active. I was active as well. Is that the Republicans have chosen to label this a terrorist attack perpetrated by al-Qaeda. It wasn't a terrorist act. It wasn't perpetrated by al-Qaeda. It was an Islamic act that was perpetrated by Ansar Sharia. The differences there are really significant. And so the right, the Republicans, become vulnerable because they've chosen a scenario that is not true to attack the lie of the president. And the truth is extraordinarily important to know, and there's no one in politics or the media that's willing to report the truth. And so you have 2 lies, both of which are vulnerable to attack, but no truth in between them.
No, of course not. You know, look, you can give me Chris Christie or you can give me Hillary Clinton. I mean, that's like asking me if I want cyanide or hemlock, okay? I mean, that's really, and they really need a new shtick. They really do. You know?
Yep. Now, here's Fox went on to say, But a New York Times report published over the weekend has angered sources who were on the ground that night. Those sources who continue to face threats of losing their jobs sharply challenged the Times findings that there was no involvement from al-Qaeda or any other international terror group, and that an anti-Islam film played a role in inciting the initial wave of attacks.
And we knew that was a lie almost immediately. We knew it was a lie before he went to the UN.
I know a lot about that film. I know a lot about the President of the United States' desire to cast Christianity as the foe. And we, of course, know a great deal about al-Qaeda, but even more about Islam. I don't think there was anybody better prepared to share what actually happened in Benghazi than we were on this program. And yes, we identified the president as not only perpetrating a lie, but explaining why this lie was so devastating and why he chose it. Now, those who opposed him were all wrong. To label it a terrorist attack is a waste of breath. Of course it was a terrorist attack. Terrorism is a tactic. But in this particular case, it's even at the far edge of terrorism. Because terrorism is when a militia or an army attacks civilian targets. None of these targets were civilian. This was actually a guerrilla attack, not a terrorist attack. But moreover, when terrorism is a tactic, why not refer to the motivation for the attack? And as it relates to the motivation, it wasn't al-Qaeda. It was Ansar Sharia. That's a terrorist group that Americans actually conceived. We made them. Back in a moment. To Shattering Myths. This is the story as presented by the New York Times. It says, months after investigation, or months of investigation, by the New York Times, centered on extensive interviews with Libyans in Benghazi who had direct knowledge of the attack there and its context. Now, by the way, they said they did not interview here. There's no mention of the Americans who witnessed the attack. Not from the CIA, not from the State Department, not from military intelligence, but Libyans who had direct knowledge of the attack there and its context. Turned up no evidence that al-Qaeda or other international terrorist groups had any role in the assault. The attack was led instead by fighters who had benefited directly from NATO's extensive air power and logistics support during the uprising against Colonel Gaddafi. And contrary to claims by some members of Congress, it was fueled in large part by anger at an American-made video denigrating Islam. Whoa. When it comes to half-truths and outright lies and dancing between raindrops to create a false impression, that's a beaut. It's true, to some extent, that al-Qaeda or other international terrorist groups played a minimal role in the assault. To say they played no evidence that they played any role in the assault is to disregard the New York Times' own reporting. The New York Times has written and published a series of articles directly linking al-Qaeda and other international terrorist groups to Ansar Sharia and to the attack. So they're hoping that no one reads the other articles of which we will reference here in a moment. In fact, it'd probably be tomorrow. But the fact is that this was not an al-Qaeda attack. That's our problem. The media and politicians have created the myth that we're at war against al-Qaeda. That's not true. Al-Qaeda is essentially irrelevant. Now all al-Qaeda really has is one not very charismatic spokesperson, Anwar al-Zawahiri. He's a guy that was physician in his former life, pretty well educated Muslim from the Muslim Brotherhood, who started a terrorist organization, a jihadist organization in Egypt, and wreaked havoc, killed a lot of tourists and killed a lot of folks in Egypt, and got tired having to run and hide from the Egyptian military government, who didn't like him wreaking havoc with the tourist trade by killing the tourists. That's bad for business. And so he ran off to Afghanistan, where he joined with the Taliban to go and fight the Soviet-backed government there with American weapons. And over time, because he's quite well educated, as was Osama bin Laden, the two became buds. But other than that, he has, he's not a founder of al-Qaeda. He's just simply one of Osama's pals. Al-Qaeda is irrelevant. They've essentially always been irrelevant. If the one time al-Qaeda was relevant is when America was literally conceiving them and using them to give the Russians a taste of what they gave us in Vietnam. It was a plan conceived by Zbigniew Brzezinski and Jimmy Carter. It led to the deaths of millions of Afghanis. And it led up to retribution later to Americans. But that's it. They're irrelevant other than that. Al-Qaeda doesn't have a manifesto. They don't have their own constitution. They don't have their own unique agenda. Osama bin Laden, all he cared about, all he ever quoted was the Quran and the Hadith. Al-Qaeda is simply a symptom of Islam. It is a manifestation of Islam. To look at the manifestation as opposed to the entity itself is stupidity. To suggest that there's a difference between Al-Qaeda and Islam, a manifestation and the entity itself, is utter stupidity. And so, no, it wasn't Al-Qaeda that was primarily involved. It was Ansar Sharia, a homegrown Islamic terrorist organization in Libya that was given birth and armed by America's intervention. This is a story we'll continue with in our program tomorrow.